Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd, the clinking of silverware and muffled conversations blending into a background hum that should have made the evening feel warm and lively, but instead, it felt like just another stage where she was expected to play her part and smile through the neglect. Melissa sat at the long, polished wooden table surrounded by her family, forcing herself to sip her lukewarm water while her mother went on and on about Jessica's big promotion as if it were the most important thing in the world. Jessica, younger by 4 years, but somehow always the center of attention, sat across from her with a smug little smile, nodding along as their mother praised her hard work and determination, as though she had clawed her way to success from the depths of struggle instead of riding the wave of favoritism that had cushioned her entire life. Melissa barely heard the words anymore because she had heard variations of them for years, and by now, they all blurred into the same dismissive sentiment: Jessica mattered, and she didn't. Her father, sitting stiffly at the head of the table, barely made eye contact with her as he sipped his whiskey, occasionally nodding in agreement with her mother's glowing monologue. Her brother-in-law, Mark, an unremarkable man with an equally unremarkable job, chuckled at all the right moments, playing the supportive husband role he had perfected over the years. Even her cousin Rachel, who Melissa barely spoke to outside of these forced family gatherings, had more to say about Jessica's promotion than she ever had about Melissa's accomplishments. It was her birthday, and yet here she was, watching the people who were supposed to love her barely acknowledge that fact. She had been through this routine before, but tonight, something inside her felt different. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the years of swallowing her pride, or maybe it was the cold realization that she no longer cared enough to pretend anymore. She had spent so many years trying to be seen, to be good enough, to be the daughter they would be proud of, but what had it ever gotten her? A seat at a table where she was an afterthought? Melissa, are you even listening? Her mother's sharp voice cut through her thoughts, making her blink and look up. She forced a tight smile, her fingers tightening around her fork as she nodded. Of course, she said, though she hadn't caught a single word of whatever had been said. Her mother sighed dramatically, shaking her head as if Melissa had just failed some invisible test. I was saying, it's just so inspiring to see Jessica achieve so much at such a young age. She's always been so driven, you know? It reminds me of when she was in high school and won that state competition. Do you remember that, honey? She asked, turning to their father. He nodded absently, swirling the ice in his drink. Of course. She's always been a go-getter. Melissa felt her stomach twist, not with sadness, not with longing, but with something sharper, something colder. It wasn't just that they ignored her accomplishments, it was that they didn't even see her. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they had never cared. The waiter arrived with the food, setting down plates of steaming entrees, and for a moment, the conversation shifted to something as mundane as portion sizes and sauce preferences. Melissa focused on cutting her steak, methodically slicing through the tender meat, taking small, deliberate bites as she counted down the minutes until she could leave. And then, just as she had resigned herself to another birthday spent fading into the background, her mother reached into her purse and pulled out a small, brightly colored envelope, sliding it across the table with a casual air that made it clear this was an afterthought, an obligation rather than a heartfelt gesture. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, her tone breezy, distracted. "Didn't have time to get you anything special, but I figured you could get yourself something nice." Melissa looked at the envelope, at the cheap, mass-produced design on the front, at the way her mother didn't even meet her eyes as she handed it over. A gift card. Not even wrapped, not even with a note. She didn't even bother to ask if Melissa liked it because it wasn't about her. It was never about her. She heard Jessica snicker under her breath, and that was the moment something inside Melissa snapped, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the cold, calculated realization that she was done playing their game. She set her fork down carefully, wiped her mouth with her napkin, and took the envelope with a polite nod. She tucked it into her purse without looking at it, and then, with a small, serene smile, she reached for her phone. "That's fine," she said, her voice light, almost cheerful. "I just bought myself a new car." Silence. The entire table froze, every conversation screeching to a halt, every fork hovering midair as they processed her words. Jessica's smirk faltered. Their mother blinked, confusion flashing across her face. Their father finally set down his glass, staring at her as though he had misheard. For the first time in years, every single person at that table was paying attention to her. Melissa took another sip of water, letting the silence stretch, letting them all sit in it. And then, just to twist the knife a little deeper, she set her phone down on the table and turned the screen toward them, showing the crisp, high-resolution image of her brand-new luxury sedan sitting in her driveway, gleaming under the sun like a quiet declaration of freedom. No words needed to be spoken. For the first time in her life, she wasn't asking for their approval. She had already given it to herself. Melissa could not remember a single birthday from her childhood where she had felt truly celebrated, because every single one had been overshadowed by something related to Jessica, whether it was a dance recital, a minor academic award, or simply their parents deciding that it just was not necessary to make a big deal out of it. She learned early on that she was the daughter who would always get the smaller slice of the cake, the one whose accomplishments would be acknowledged with a polite nod instead of fanfare, the one who would always be standing just slightly outside the spotlight, watching her younger sister bask in the glow of their parents' unrelenting adoration. She could remember being 7 years old and unwrapping a coloring book and a pack of cheap crayons while Jessica, barely 3 at the time, was handed a brand new dollhouse, one of those extravagant ones with working lights and miniature furniture, the kind that little girls dream about and beg Santa to bring. When she had asked, in that hesitant, hopeful way that children do, why Jessica got something so much bigger and better, her mother had sighed as if the question exhausted her and said, "Sweetheart, she's just a baby. She needs things to play with." It was always an excuse, always a reason why Melissa should understand and accept that she would get less, while Jessica would always get more. The pattern only deepened as they grew older, as Jessica was praised for achievements that were, at best, average, while Melissa's hard-earned victories were met with indifference. When Jessica won a second-place ribbon in a local art contest, their parents framed it and hung it in the living room, beaming with pride every time a guest noticed it. When Melissa won first place in a statewide science competition, her mother had simply muttered, "That's nice, dear," before asking if she could help Jessica pick out a dress for an upcoming school dance. Christmases were the same predictable ritual of unbalanced affection, with Jessica unwrapping beautifully wrapped boxes filled with designer clothes, expensive perfume, or the latest gadgets, while Melissa was handed a single sweater, usually one size too big, with a tag that suggested it had been grabbed off a clearance rack at the last minute. There was no malice in their actions, no outright cruelty, just a quiet, relentless disregard for her in favor of the daughter they had decided was worth more of their attention. By the time she was in college, she had stopped expecting anything different, had trained herself to smile and say thank you even when she felt invisible, had convinced herself that it was better to be independent than to beg for scraps of love from people who were never going to give it freely. When she graduated with honors, she had held out the faintest hope that maybe, just maybe, her family would recognize the significance of it, but instead, her parents had skipped the ceremony entirely, claiming that they were too busy helping Jessica move into her new apartment. It had been a slap in the face, one she had swallowed down with a bitter smile, but the real insult had come later when she discovered that they had thrown Jessica a housewarming party with catered food and balloons, as if her renting a small one-bedroom apartment was a grander accomplishment than Melissa spending years working toward a degree. That had been the moment she had truly understood that it was never going to change, that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how successful she became, she would always be an afterthought to the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. She had learned to stop sharing her victories with them, had stopped looking for pride in their eyes, had stopped hoping for the kind of love that came so easily for Jessica. When she bought her first home, a charming little place with a wraparound porch and a beautiful backyard, she had hesitated before telling her parents, waiting to see if, just this once, they would surprise her. But her mother had simply hummed over the phone, barely paying attention as she rattled off some excuse about being too busy to visit, while a week later, she and their father had driven 3 hours just to take Jessica shopping for furniture. So when she sat at that birthday dinner, listening to her mother sing Jessica's praises as if the world revolved around her, something inside her had gone still, had hardened into a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She had played the role of the overlooked daughter for long enough, had accepted their indifference for too many years, and now, for the first time, she had decided that she was no longer willing to sit quietly and accept the crumbs they threw her way. Buying the car had not been about proving a point, at least not to them, but rather a statement to herself that she was done waiting for validation from people who had never cared enough to give it. She had made her own success, had built a life entirely separate from their approval, and when she had seen the stunned expressions on their faces at the dinner table, the absolute shock that she had done something significant without their input, she had felt something close to satisfaction. But she was not done yet, because this was not just about a car or a single birthday dinner. It was about a lifetime of being underestimated, about every moment she had been pushed aside, about every time they had failed to see her worth. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to make them see exactly what they had ignored for so long. Melissa sat at the dinner table, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on her, enjoying the way her mother's face twisted with something between confusion and discomfort. The way her father furrowed his brow as if he were trying to piece together some puzzle he hadn't even realized existed until this very moment. Jessica, predictably, was the first to speak, her voice carrying that same condescending lilt she had used all their lives whenever Melissa did something that made her feel even slightly threatened. "You?" Jessica scoffed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the stem of her wine glass as she tilted her head, her lips curving into a smirk that barely masked the flicker of insecurity in her eyes. "A new car? Must be a used one, right?" Melissa didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give her sister the satisfaction of seeing even a trace of irritation cross her face, because she had spent years perfecting the art of keeping her emotions hidden behind an easy, unreadable expression. Instead, she simply let her lips curl into a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that was just enough to unsettle Jessica without giving her anything to latch onto. "Oh, no," Melissa said, her voice smooth and steady, her fingers wrapping around the stem of her own glass as she took a small, measured sip. "Brand new, actually. Right off the lot, fully loaded, every feature you could imagine. I figured, why not treat myself for once?" The silence that followed was thick enough to cut through, heavy with unspoken questions, with barely concealed resentment, with the dawning realization that Melissa had done something none of them had expected. Jessica's smirk faltered, her fingers tightening around her glass, her carefully crafted confidence slipping for just a second before she recovered, forcing out a dry, humorless laugh that was meant to sound dismissive, but instead came off as strained. "Wow," Jessica said, her tone laced with something ugly, something bitter. "That's surprising. I didn't think you were the type to splurge like that." Melissa tilted her head, letting her smile linger, letting the weight of her silence stretch out just long enough to make Jessica squirm before she finally responded, her tone light, almost amused. "Well," she said, swirling the wine in her glass as she glanced toward her mother, who had yet to say a single word since Melissa had dropped the bombshell. "I guess I just figured, if no one else was going to celebrate me, I might as well do it myself." The implication hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, Melissa watched as her mother struggled for words, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to argue, to refute, to deny, but couldn't quite figure out how to do it without proving Melissa's point. Her father cleared his throat, setting his drink down with a little more force than necessary, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "That's quite the purchase," he said, his voice measured, carefully neutral in the way it always was when he was trying to avoid taking a side. Must have set you back quite a bit. Melissa let the moment stretch, let them all sit in their own discomfort, let them wonder, let them speculate, let them realize that for once, she wasn't going to shrink under their scrutiny, wasn't going to apologize for taking up space, wasn't going to let them diminish her success the way they always had. "Well, you know," she said, setting her glass down with a quiet clink, her gaze flickering back to Jessica just in time to catch the way her sister's jaw clenched. "I've been doing pretty well for myself lately. Figured it was time to enjoy the benefits of my hard work." Jessica's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering behind them, because she knew Melissa, knew that she wasn't the type to flaunt, wasn't the type to seek validation, wasn't the type to throw money around just for the sake of it. If she had made a move like this, it meant there was something more beneath the surface, something bigger, something Jessica couldn't quite put her finger on, and that uncertainty was enough to make her shift in her seat, enough to make her rethink whatever condescending remark she had been about to spit out. Melissa could feel the shift in the air, could feel the tension thickening around them, could feel the weight of the realization settling over them like an unspoken truth they weren't ready to confront. She wasn't the same Melissa they had always known, wasn't the quiet, forgotten daughter who accepted whatever scraps of attention they threw her way, wasn't the passive, overlooked woman who smiled through their indifference and pretended it didn't bother her. No, this time was different. Because this time, Melissa had a plan. And none of them saw it coming. Melissa was not surprised when her mother finally called her, though she took her time before answering, letting the phone ring a little longer than necessary, savoring the idea that for once, they were the ones waiting on her instead of the other way around. She had been expecting this call ever since the dinner, ever since she had watched their faces tighten with barely concealed jealousy, ever since Jessica had scoffed and tried to belittle her purchase, ever since her father had given her that scrutinizing look, trying to figure out how his forgotten daughter had suddenly become someone worth noticing. Melissa, her mother's voice came through the line, breezy yet calculated, carrying that forced casualness she always used when she was trying to mask her true intentions. "I was just thinking about you, sweetheart. How have you been?" Melissa leaned back in her chair, resting her feet on the edge of her coffee table, staring out the window as she let her mother's words settle between them for a moment before responding. "I've been great, Mom. Really great, actually." "Oh, that's nice to hear," her mother said, but there was an unmistakable hesitation in her voice, as if she was waiting for Melissa to slip up, to give her something to latch onto, to confirm whatever narrative she had already constructed in her mind. "I saw Jessica the other day, and she mentioned you got a new car. I have to say, that's quite a surprise. I didn't even know you were looking for one." Melissa smiled to herself, because of course Jessica had been the one to bring it up, and of course, their mother had chosen her words carefully, wrapping them in just enough doubt to make it sound less like praise and more like suspicion. "Yeah, I figured it was time for an upgrade," she said, keeping her voice light, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her mother uncomfortable. "Well," her mother continued after a pause, her tone shifting slightly, moving into that territory where concern and condescension blurred together. "I just wanted to check in, to make sure everything is all right. A big purchase like that can be a lot to handle, and I know you've always been, well, a little cautious with money." Melissa let out a quiet laugh, because she knew exactly what her mother was trying to do, knew that this call was not about concern but about confirmation, about proving to herself that Melissa had made a reckless decision, that she had overstepped, that she had tried to play in a league she did not belong in. But Melissa had spent her whole life watching them underestimate her, had spent years listening to them talk about her as if she were someone barely holding herself together, had endured their backhanded comments disguised as advice, their subtle digs wrapped in concern, their perpetual belief that she was incapable of standing on her own. "Well, you don't have to worry about me, Mom," Melissa said, keeping her voice smooth, letting just a hint of amusement creep in. "I can definitely afford it, and honestly, I figured I deserved something nice after the last few months." "Oh!" Her mother's voice sharpened with curiosity because Melissa rarely talked about herself, rarely offered up details about her life, rarely gave them anything to dissect. Something happen? Melissa let the moment linger, let her mother wait, let her sit in the same kind of anticipation Melissa had felt so many times before when she had waited for them to acknowledge her, to see her, to care. And then, with a casualness that was almost cruel in its simplicity, she said, "Oh, yeah. I got a huge promotion at work." Silence. A silence so thick, so absolute, that Melissa could almost picture the way her mother's face must have frozen, the way her fingers might have tightened around the phone, the way her entire body might have gone still with the sudden realization that for once, Jessica was not the one at the center of the conversation. A promotion? Her mother finally said, and Melissa could hear the strain behind her words, the forced attempt at enthusiasm, the barely contained shock. "Well, that's surprising." Melissa didn't bother pretending she didn't hear the hesitation, didn't bother softening the edges of her words. "Yeah, it's a big step up. More responsibility, bigger salary, a lot of new opportunities." Another pause. Then, right on cue, the backhanded remarks began. "Well, money isn't everything, you know," her mother said, her tone taking on that artificially wise quality she always used when she was trying to diminish something she didn't understand. "I just hope you're not taking on too much. That kind of job can be really stressful, and you've always been a bit, well, you know, sensitive to pressure." Melissa exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against the arm of her chair, feeling that familiar, dull frustration bubbling beneath her ribs. They had always done this, had always acted as though she were fragile, as though she needed to be handled carefully, as though she wasn't capable of holding her own. It was infuriating in its predictability, exhausting in its persistence, but this time, it didn't hurt the way it once would have. Because Melissa knew something they didn't. She had already won. She had spent her whole life waiting for them to acknowledge her, waiting for them to see her, waiting for them to care, but she no longer needed it, no longer wanted it, no longer cared about proving anything to them. Her mother could downplay her success, could pretend it was not as impressive as it was, could act as if it was some temporary stroke of luck instead of the result of years of hard work, but none of that mattered. Because Melissa wasn't seeking approval anymore. She was done explaining herself. And she wasn't finished yet. Melissa had always believed that family was supposed to be an unshakable foundation, a place where love was given freely, where support was unconditional, where being seen and heard did not have to be earned like a privilege. But she had also learned, through years of quiet disappointment and unspoken hurt, that sometimes the people you called family were nothing more than ghosts who haunted your life, appearing only when it served them, offering nothing but hollow words and performative affection. She had spent too many years playing the role they had assigned to her, the one who was easy to overlook, the one who never demanded too much, the one who accepted whatever scraps of attention they chose to throw her way. But that version of her no longer existed, and she was done pretending that any of them deserved a place in her life. The calls started slowly at first, a few missed ones from her mother, a short text from her father asking if she had a minute to talk, a vague, seemingly innocent message from her cousin Rachel that said, "Haven't heard from you in a while, everything okay?" Melissa read them all, let them sit unanswered, let the weight of her silence hang in the air between them like an unfinished sentence that they were too afraid to complete. She knew what they were doing, knew that they were trying to feel out just how far she was willing to take this, knew that they were expecting her to crack first, to cave, to slip back into the quiet, compliant daughter who would eventually come running back, desperate for their approval. But the truth was, Melissa had never felt lighter in her life. For years, she had waited by the phone, had been the one to reach out, had sat through conversations where she was treated like an afterthought, had attended family gatherings where she was nothing more than a background character in the Jessica show. But now, as she let their messages pile up, as she let their calls go to voicemail, as she ignored yet another invitation to some dinner she knew would end with her mother gushing about Jessica's latest achievement, She realized something she had never truly understood before. She did not owe them anything. She did not owe them her time. She did not owe them her explanations. She did not owe them a place in her life simply because they shared the same blood. The final call came late one evening, the screen lighting up with Jessica's name, the one person who had not bothered to reach out until now, the one who had likely been watching from a distance, waiting to see how long Melissa would keep up this act, waiting for the moment when she would finally fold and come crawling back like she always did. Melissa let the phone ring, watched the seconds tick by, counted down in her head as she let it go to voicemail, knowing without a doubt that Jessica would call again, that she would not let it go, that she would demand an answer because that was the way she had always been. Entitled, impatient, unwilling to accept that the world did not revolve around her. And sure enough, less than a minute later, the phone rang again, Jessica's name flashing across the screen, the notification sitting there like a challenge, like a dare. This time, Melissa answered. "You're being ridiculous." Jessica's voice came through the line before Melissa even had a chance to say hello, sharp and biting, filled with the kind of anger that only came from someone who had never been ignored in their entire life. "Seriously, what the hell is wrong with you?" Melissa didn't react, didn't let the words sink under her skin the way Jessica intended them to, didn't let herself feel anything other than the quiet, steady certainty that she was making the right choice. "I'm busy," she said simply, her voice calm, measured, controlled. "Oh, don't give me that," Jessica snapped, and Melissa could almost picture her pacing, her free hand waving in frustration, her perfectly curated world tilting just enough to make her feel uneasy. "Mom's been calling, Dad's been calling, even Rachel asked if something was wrong with you. And now, what, you're just ignoring everyone? What is this, some kind of tantrum?" Melissa exhaled slowly, staring at the city lights outside her window, letting the weight of the moment settle over her, letting herself feel the finality of what she was about to say. "For years, I settled for scraps of love," she said, her voice unwavering, her words slow and deliberate. "Now, I don't need any of you." Jessica went silent, and for a brief second, Melissa thought maybe, just maybe, she would hear something real in her voice, something that wasn't defensiveness or irritation, something that resembled regret or understanding. But instead, Jessica laughed, a cold, humorless sound that carried nothing but bitterness. "You're so dramatic," she muttered, and Melissa could hear the venom dripping from every syllable. "Fine, be that way. But don't come crawling back when you realize how much you need us." Melissa didn't respond, didn't waste another second of her time arguing with someone who had never once tried to understand her, never once cared to see beyond her own reflection. Instead, she simply pulled the phone away from her ear, scrolled down to Jessica's name, and pressed block. And then she did the same for every single one of them. Her mother, her father, her cousin Rachel, the entire family group chat. She erased them from her life as easily as they had erased her from theirs, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt free. The night air was cool as she stepped outside, as she climbed into the driver's seat of her brand new car, as she rolled down the windows and turned up the music, letting the sound wash over her like a cleansing wave. The city lights stretched out before her, endless and full of possibility, and as she drove away, she didn't look back. She had spent her entire life waiting to be loved the way she deserved. Now, she was finally ready to love herself enough to walk away.